All right, so tonight we're going to, as I said, speak about the idea of depression, and we're really talking about mental mood. We'll touch a little bit on anxiety and how everything is related to everything else, as I said, and how to look at this from the perspective of the body, not necessarily from a psychological perspective. And what we know now is that the COVID crisis is basically not just affecting us because of COVID, but there's an incredible mental health burden that is happening. And the World Health Organization, which is where I got these statistics, did a survey of people, and 40%, so let's look at it, 40% reported one adverse mental or behavioral health condition during the crisis, 26% reported symptoms of a trauma, 13% reported starting or increasing substance abuse to cope. 11% considered suicide. That's an unbelievably high number. 18 to 24-year-olds were most affected, with 75% reporting symptoms. And 1 week after the global pandemic was declared, 78% of all antidepressants and anti-anxiety prescriptions were new. Now, we know that the number of people that are already on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicines is incredibly high already. So the fact that 78% of those were new within 1 week is staggering, in just absolutely staggering. Obviously, when we think about 11% considering suicide and the burden that it's having, not just on 18 to 24-year-olds, but also on children, especially children that are not at school. Because we know, unfortunately, speaking just nutritionally, that school kids, even though the school lunches are obviously of questionable nutritional sufficiency, unfortunately, they are on average much better than what they're getting at home. And so, unfortunately, there's also a nutritional crisis happening with kids as well. Kids often gain weight when they're home over the summer. There's been studies to show that over the summer, when kids are at home, they gain a pound or two, and they don't lose it during the year. And each year they gain a pound or two. So when kids are just at home and eating, then we're going to have an increased problem with the pediatric obesity crisis, in addition to the fact that obviously it's affecting their ability to socialize. So many things happening from a behavioral and mental health perspective that is not actually being acknowledged as much as I think it should. These are sort of like the law of, it's unintended consequences of some of the things that are happening as a response to this terrible crisis that we're going through. So let's look at depression from various different causes. Again, we're trying to focus tonight on looking at it from the perspective of the body as opposed to the brain. Now, this is episode 42, and if you have been following along with me, you know that, as I said at the very beginning of tonight's episode, that everything is connected, and therefore, when we're looking at this, we're basically going to be looking at it from other connections. All right, so let's close some of these down. So roughly, we can look at it from a psychological perspective, which we're really not going to be doing tonight. We are really going to be looking at it from different perspectives. And as you can see, we'll talk about the gut-brain axis, which we've touched on before. We'll talk about it from a genomics perspective, genes, and whether or not there's anything in your food that can affect your genes, that can affect your mood. And then we'll just briefly touch on inflammation, and that will definitely be enough to cover. And really, as I said, the goal here is to come away not with necessarily remembering everything that I'm talking about tonight, but to realize in a very real and concrete way that this can be looked at and should be looked at as a broad, of having lots of different broad causes, essentially. So let's look at some of the biological features that are in common with people who are just ill. Well, a fair number of people who have depression actually have increased body temperature, especially at night. Now, all the changes, biological changes that are in common, depression with, say, inflammation, these are not at the same level of inflammation. We'll talk about that as we go on. And most of these are just they have common features, but not to the extent. So while they have an increased body temperature, it's certainly not like if they had a fever. This CRP and interleukin 6, which is a cytokine, in other words, it's like a messenger to signal inflammation in the body. These are often, in many patients with depression, elevated. Other inflammatory cytokines are also have been implicated in depression. In other words, there's certain interleukin, as an example, that when it goes up in the blood, it is correlated directly with having symptoms of depression. And things like zinc and vitamin D deficiency have been shown to be more common in people who are depressed, which doesn't mean that it's a cause of depression, but it's contributing to the milieu, the setting of the body is associated with various different things going on. And so while we can't make a direct causal relationship, nonetheless, zinc and vitamin D deficiency have been shown to be more common in people who are depressed. You could say maybe, they're not eating well because they're depressed and therefore they're not getting enough zinc, or most of the times when they come up with ideas like that, they try to eliminate those causes in the studies. But nonetheless, the body is in a situation where zinc and vitamin D deficiency has been shown to be more common. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the gut and specifically the vagus nerve, which we've touched on before. And I'd like to go into it in a little more detail because it's really a fascinating nerve. And it's really amazing how this one nerve can have so much to do with so many different things. And it's one of those things that a lot of you maybe have never even heard of the vagus nerve. And at the end of when we go through this, you'll wonder why you haven't heard of it, because it plays so many different roles in your body, and manipulating it and getting it under control and understanding it is really key to understanding your body, understanding your ability to relax and to regulate mood and to affect your gut and your heart rate. You'll see all that as we go through. But let's talk a little bit about gut dysbiosis. Now, gut dysbiosis is basically when your microbiome, the bacteria in your gut, are basically out of whack. In other words, you want to think about it in this way. Your microbiome, which is made up of bacteria and viruses and fungi, all these living in this really complex ecosystem. It's sort of like going into the rainforest, and the rainforest is this has incredible biodiversity. It's got plants and animals and insects and fungi and everything that you could think of. And it's in this very delicate balance. So if you remove, say, a couple species, then that can affect other species, which can affect other species. The point to remember is, in this analogy, is that when you have a diverse microbiome, that is what makes it most healthy. Just like if you were to walk into the rainforest, it's the enormous diversity of life that creates the beauty and the health of the rainforest. Well, the same thing happens in your gut. And when the diversity of the gut is not as good as it should be, you get what's called dysbiosis, which is basically where you get some organisms growing out of proportion to others, kind of like if you've seen a lake and all of a sudden it has an algae bloom. And you know that is a feature of a very, very unhealthy lake, because there's sometimes that chokes out the oxygen and then the fish die. And it's a trigger of sorts. And so when the same thing happens in your gut and you get dysbiosis and you get one type of organism growing out of proportion to the others, it's not being kept in check. That's basically what gut dysbiosis is. And that is associated with inflammation. It's associated with depression as well. It's associated with immune response issues. In other words, connected to your gut is the largest, basically, part of your nervous system, and your immune system is connected to your gut. It's surrounded by gut immune tissue. So when the internal part is not working well, then that's going to affect the overall immune balance of your body. It's been shown that Bacteroides species have actually been associated with depression, and Bacteroides species are associated with gut dysbiosis. Whereas when you have lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, those are associated with not only a better mood, but also a better immune response, because the inside of your intestine is healthy, which is going to reflect in all that immune tissue that surrounds the intestine and surrounds the gastrointestinal system. There's glutamate and Gaba. We'll get into that a little bit later, and of course serotonin, which we also touched on. But basically, there are these are glutamate is associated with excitability, and GABA is associated with calming, and serotonin is a mood regulator. And believe it or not, these are actually in the gut in addition to the brain, and they are released in the gut and in the brain. So amazingly, you're getting this situation here in the gut that it's almost acting like a brain. It's called sometimes by people, the gut, the second brain, because of all the nervous system tissue around all the nerves that innervate the gut. It's such a huge mass of these nerves that it's like a brain. That's why they call it the second brain. And because of all these nerves, you're gonna get this association with modulation and changing of serotonin, glutamate, GABA, all of these things that are going to affect the mood. So there's no way, even from a biochemical perspective, in other words, looking at it just chemically, there's no way to separate the brain from the gut, because these things are going to be released, absorbed, and they're going to be released from the brain. They're going to release from the gut, and so you need to have this sort of gut brain axis, this gut brain partnership, and that's basically what we have. And that's being learned about more and more as the years go by, that these two things are incredibly related. And so if we want to take care of our mental state, then we need to take care of our gut. We obviously need to take care of our brain as well, of course. So I'm not saying that just by doing the gut that you don't have to pay attention to the brain, just that these two things are connected and they are in an alliance, and it's very difficult to separate them. There are obviously social determinants of causes of depression. We spoke briefly about that before, that when people are in a perceived low part of society, that causes actually a change in the neurochemistry of the brain, which can affect your immune system. It can affect how you feel about yourself, depression, etc. And of course, there are evolutionary theories. One of the most common is called the pathogen host defense hypothesis, which basically says that that when there's some sort of stressor or danger or something that would cause someone to reduce their activity, to withdraw as a sort of defense mechanism, such that therefore they are withdrawing from maybe a possible pathogen, and they are going to build themselves up to mount an immune response. If this is something that is true, of course, it's just a hypothesis, that what would really happen is, if that is the case, what happens if we're already in a poor state, that we're overweight with increased inflammation just from obesity, lack of movement, all these sorts of environmental toxins, then what happens? And the answer, of course, would be that if this is a situation that actually happens, then the ongoing problems that we're dealing with in modern society is just going to make it a whole lot worse, and obviously predispose you to have all kinds of horrible things happening on top of that. All right, so let's move on to the gut-brain axis, which I've spoken about a little bit already, this alliance that we've spoken about. I've already spoken about how diversity is the key here in the gut. And the way you get diversity in the gut, you might be asking yourself, and really the best way of getting diversity in the gut is to have an incredibly diverse diet. specifically of various kinds of plant fibers. So that's why I've spoken at length over the many weeks that we've been together that it's important to increase the diversity of the plants that you're eating beyond the classes that they're in. A lot of people are used to just eating cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, kale, collards, mustard greens. And while I think those probably should be a good, 40, 50% even of the vegetables that you're eating, the rest of the vegetables should be in various other families, because that's going to that's going to allow you to take in various different kinds of fibers. We spoke about fiber in one particular 1 hour episode. I don't remember which one it was, but we spoke about all the different kinds of fibers, like resistant starch, et cetera, and, insoluble, soluble fiber, all of these things. And the key really is, if you're eating a wide diversity of plants of different families, you are going to be able to optimize and give your gut the greatest chance that you're going to have the most diversity. And that's always going to yield a much better microbiome as well. The microbiome, which is what we're specifically talking about right now, is that it's basically involved in the first step in cytokine production, which is basically what we spoke about. These are these inflammatory signaling molecules. They sort of signal your immune system. And it starts in the neurons, which is just another sort of indicator that all of this is neurological. And the gut is very much a neurological organ in many, many ways. Now, the vagus nerve is what I wanted to spend a little more time out tonight, because I've referenced it before. And it really is an amazing nerve. Now, we'll go through it briefly. So let's actually start down here. So in Latin, it actually means wandering, and you'll see why. And I'm going to blow this up here. Now, this is, when I see this, I get incredible memories of medical school. This is in a diagram, of course, of anatomy, and it was done by a guy named Frank Netter, who was a doctor who never practiced medicine, but became a medical illustrator, basically. And his drawings are so famous. In fact, I still keep his anatomy textbook. And anyway, I'm getting memories of gross anatomy in medical school. When I see this, I spent so many hours poring over his drawings because they were so incredible to understanding things. So we have the brain up here, and this is the vagus nerve. Whoops, let me blow this up a little more. So the vagus nerve is basically right here, and it innervates the back of the ear. It supplies the back of the throat and the pharynx and the larynx. So look how long this thing goes. It goes all the way down. Okay, so here's the heart, the aorta here. So it's supplying the heart. In other words, when you activate the vagus nerve, it's going to slow down the heart rate, and it's going down into the nerves around the heart, and then it's going and it's affecting the musculature of the entire gut. So it starts all the way up in the brain. It's one of the 12 cranial nerves. So it starts all the way up in the brain. None of the other cranial nerves, they stay in the cranium. That's why they're called cranial nerves for the most part. The vagus nerve goes all the way down through the neck, all the way down into the gut. It's an incredible nerve. Now, why am I so amazed by this nerve? You might be asking yourself. Well, let's go into it a little bit more in detail. Close some of these things down. Let me just close this since it's taking up so much space. Okay. So it connects the brain to the stomach. It is, as I said, basically essential part gut-brain axis. It also regulates food intake and satiety. So we've spoken about some of those chemicals like ghrelin in the past that also affected that way. It stimulates the heart, as I said, lowers resting rate. Some of you may have heard of vasovagal event where someone will pass out because of seeing blood or emotional upset or something of that case. The reason why that happens is because it's an overreaction of the nerve. And what happens is because it innervates, it affects the heart. It's going to affect the heart and the blood pressure, and then that's why you pass out. So, so that's associated with people pass out from emotional distress. As I said, stimulates the muscles of the pharynx and larynx in the back of the throat. And essentially, it's the main part of what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, which I've spoken about before, that you have the active part of your nervous system, which is fight or flight, and then you have the rest and recharge, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you have what's called good vagal tone, meaning your vagus nerve is responsive and it can lower your heart rate down when it needs to lower it, and it can help you with food intake such that you're in a relaxed state to be able to digest. It can allow, it's connected to the contraction of the gut, which basically means that if you have poor vagal tone, then the passage of the food through the gut is going to be disordered because it controls the sort of contractions of the gut all the way through the gut. So that means that because it's associated with all these things, as well as not only hormonal, we spoke about hormonal in the sense of like hunger hormones, but also associated with neuronal and bacterial changes in the bowel, are basically communicated to the brain. In other words, the vagus nerve is receiving that information and communicating it. Now, what happens if the vagal tone, which I've just described, is all messed up? Well, it's not going to communicate those really important messages to the brain. So we've established that the brain and the gut are basically in this alliance, and they need to be able to communicate as partners. And if the vagus nerve is not functioning the way it's supposed to, in other words, it's being shut off because you're under so much stress. In other words, that other wing of the immune system is just shutting down the vagus nerve, then you are basically cutting those things apart, the brain and the gut, and they're not going to be able to communicate. And when they can't communicate, then the vagus nerve is not going to be able to communicate those things back to the brain, which is going to be associated, again, with all of these things: food intake, mood, satiety, all of these things, an incredible number of things with this nerve that starts all the way up in your brain and goes all the way down and is this incredible nerve. So how do we activate this nerve? How do we make sure our vagus nerve is healthy? Because we can see that we want to make sure that that alliance is working well. So how do we do that? So let's talk about that. So the first thing to know is that there is electric vagal nerve stimulation, and that they basically insert something like a pacemaker where they can actually activate the vagus nerve. Remarkably, this is good for seizures. It's also good for depression. It's been shown to actually greatly improve many people who have resistance to medicines for depression. So it has an incredible use, just medically speaking. In fact, even in the condition of psoriasis, there was a study done where they actually used a vagal nerve electrostimulator and saw improvement in psoriasis. Well, why would that work? Well, it's hard to really say exactly, but one could certainly, but definitively, but one could certainly make guesses. One is it's going to cause you to be more relaxed. In other words, it's going to activate the rest and recharge part of your nervous system. Also, a lot of people feel that the gut is associated with a lot of autoimmune diseases. And if the gut is not healthy, or at least not able to communicate properly, then you're going to see situations where certain things like autoimmune diseases that are associated with inflammation, especially, are going to be, affected. So what can we do to activate the vagus nerve system, the vagus nerve? We spoke about by having a device, but obviously that's not something that that we're going to get done because unless we need it for some medical condition. Well, there's various things. One is resonant breathing. I spoke about that last week, and I'm going to speak about it next week as well. And that's basically a frequency of breathing that is going to synchronize the breathing with the heart, which is going to sort of allow the vagus nerve to all of that to sync up essentially. And there was an amazing book called, I can't remember the name of it, but it was about breathing. And really, he traveled the world talking to people who have studied breathing, from people who are advanced meditators to other people who are using breathing to affect the immune system. All these sort of, I think he called them like breathonauts or something like that. And really, I'm oversimplifying the book, but basically, at the end of the book, or one of the big lessons of the book was that if you can just get sort of a 6x6 breath per minute down, then that pretty much activates everything that you would want to activate to be able to enter a very deep state of relaxation. All the meditative traditions around the world, when you look at the frequency of the breathing exercises that they do, all end up somewhere around 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute. As I mentioned last week, there's an app that I have on my phone which allows you to, you don't have to become a quote, meditator or anything of the sort. The name of the app is called the Breathing app. And basically it can allow you to set a 6x6 breath, and it will give you a tone so that you breathe in during the increase in tone, and then you breathe out during the decrease in tone. You don't have to learn meditation. You don't have to get involved in meditative disciplines that might make your spiritual traditions, might make you feel uncomfortable with, the spiritual traditions you come from. And you can get all this benefit just from this sort of breathing. Next week, we'll talk about what that does to brainwave function, but it's also affecting the vagus nerve and is allowing you to activate the vagus nerve. Cold water to the face, especially after you've been working out, can actually activate the vagus nerve. Gargling loudly, breathing in one rate and exhaling slower is going to activate your parasympathetic nervous system or your vagus nerve. And actually salivation. And it's really interesting when I found out that salivation does it, because in the Chinese tradition of Qigong, which is sort of like Tai Chi, and they actually have in one school of Qigong, most schools actually get to a point at advanced stages where they cultivate sort of salivation in the mouth and get it really, really going. And of course, isn't that amazing? Because anytime you're sort of activating that purposefully, you're actually activating your vagus nerve, which is going to be associated with deep states of relaxation and increased health. Remember, of course, I've just been mentioning the fact that it's associated with increased relaxation, but don't forget all of the other things we spoke about and all the things that are affected by the nervous system, from the gut to the heart to the brain, all of these things. And so if you can get this vagus nerve in a really optimal state, then you're going to have an incredibly profound improvement in your overall health and well-being. And as we've mentioned, for people who with depression, this electrical device, this electrostimulation has actually shown to greatly improve depression. And now that you know more about the vagus nerve, you kind of can understand why that would be. But if you're dealing with depression, of course, all of these things, especially relaxation and such associated with vagal nerve tone, which is what we're talking about, is going to be really great for you. So it's amazing that we haven't really come across, we've sort of superficially come across the vagus nerve during the talks. And, I felt like this was a good episode to sort of go into a little bit more detail. We spoke about various hormones and proteins affect the brain that are released in the gut. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But again, we've established the fact that the brain and the gut are communicating in very, very deep ways. And we need to sort of honor that connection and realize that that there are all kinds of things released by the gut that are going to affect the brain. So your gut health is going to be very, very important for your brain. Rat studies show improvement in anxiety and depression with probiotics. Don't ask me how they tell that the rats are depressed. They definitely have ways of assessing anxiety for sure. But there are studies to show that, as I mentioned, Bacteroides, I spoke about before, is shown with negative effect, and lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, generally in most studies anyway, show improvement in the gut, and in this case, rat studies showed improvement in anxiety and depression. Okay, so nutrigenomics, you all know that I've spoken about this before, and we have many people actually on this call, I can see, who have actually gone through some of, who've gotten tested for their genes. And I just wanted to go over these two what are essentially neurotransmitters and a couple genes that are associated with them, and make it very, very simple. So basically, we've all heard of like serotonin, and especially we spoke about that earlier, but also we know that, a lot of the common antidepressant medicines work on serotonin, SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So we know that their serotonin plays a role. We also have spoken about in the past dopamine, and we've spoken about oxytocin, which is sort of a bonding chemical. But a lot of people don't mention Gaba and glutamate. And I mention them because it's something that you can tell on your genes if you get a nutrigenomics test. As I mentioned before, glutamate is associated with excitability. And we've all heard of MSG, monosodium glutamate, and that's known as a neuroexcitatory chemical. And so glutamate is excitatory, and GABA is relaxing. And they're sort of like, they sort of are there, and they sort of balance themselves out. And you have what's called BDNF, and that's a gene and also what's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, what this does is if you have elevated levels of this, or you have the right gene, this basically modulates your glutamate level. So if you have too much glutamate and you're excitable, that's going to basically modulate that, help that. But the question is that, and I should just preface this by saying, before I go any further, that women who are depressed, who don't respond to medications, often have an issue with GABA and glutamate when it comes to depression. In men, it can just be associated with more so with just calmness versus irritability, that type of thing. Now, there's this enzyme. This is an enzyme that basically converts glutamate, the excitatory chemical, into GABA, which is the relaxing chemical. And you can check both of these. But if you have a defect in this enzyme, and you have a defect in this enzyme, then that's going to lead to a higher level of glutamate, which is going to be associated with, as I said, excitability. So what can you do? Well, running can sort of burn off, so to speak, a fish oil, which we've spoken about in other talks about how DHA and EPA, but DHA here specifically, type of fish oil that can help as well. Lithium, and remarkably, a lot of people have heard of people taking lithium when they're manic depressive or they have bipolar disorder, but remarkably, we evolved with having lithium in our water. And believe it or not, in areas where the lithium levels are low in the groundwater, there's actually increased rates of violence. And it's actually been shown almost very, very definitively that low lithium in the groundwater, just the naturally occurring, is associated with increased, violence and that sort of thing. And so there have been people talking about how it might be worthwhile in those areas to come up with something to help increase the levels of lithium. Now, when people are taking lithium, for as a medication for bipolar disorder, that is, very, very huge doses. But nowadays, actually, people are supplementing with low doses of lithium, nowhere near the medicinal levels that you would take for those conditions, and it's becoming somewhat of a trendy supplement. Saunas, red light therapy, all these can lower glutamate levels. We spoke about bifidobacteria that in the gut can actually lower glutamate. Theanine, which is found in green tea, as an example. Lion's mane mushroom can also increase BDNF as well. As some of these increase BDNF, and some of them help with sort of getting rid of glutamate. And then there's this enzyme, which we said was, remember, glutamate excitability, Gaba relaxation. So this converts glutamate into Gaba. So it gets rid of the exciting chemical into the relaxing one. And in order to do this, this enzyme needs magnesium, it needs vitamin B6, and it's made worse by sugar, caffeine. We spoke about MSG. Sucralose, aspartame can also make that worse. So here we have a situation when we're talking about two very, very specific chemicals that affect your mood, not just depression, but excitability and relaxation. And they really have a role, there really is a role to play when it comes to activity, diet, vitamins, and that's where, and gut health, because we spoke about bifidobacteria over here. So if you're going to be, if you have, that increased diversity, then that's going to be helpful as well. And honestly, that's pretty much all I wanted to speak about. There is the people talking about how we've already sort of established earlier on in tonight's episode that inflammation is associated with depression. Not everyone with depression there's some people that the hypothesis is that some people with depression they have a subtype of depression that's just associated with inflammation. The other is that maybe inflammatory pathways are activated to cope with what's considered environmental danger. In other words, it's maybe your body you have depression because of a sense that there's something going on in the environment, and your body is activating inflammatory states, because we all have to realize that inflammation, as much as it's gotten a bad rap, it does play a role in the body. You can't, if you cut yourself, your body cannot heal without generating inflammation at that location. It allows you to recruit chemicals and mediators to be able to start the healing process, or to surround something that is a foreign body. So this is, inflammation is necessary in the body. The problem is when we have this low-grade inflammation that is either created by here they're saying perceived environmental danger that's not real environmental danger, or our general level of obesity is generating inflammatory chemicals like we've spoken about before, how you can have this visceral fat that is actually releasing inflammatory chemicals. With aging, we've spoken about that there's something called senolytic cells, that are cells that release inflammatory markers as we age, and there's ways of getting rid of those that we've spoken about in some of the aging things. So there are, unfortunately, negative inflammation things that we've spoken about in the past as well. But inflammation does play a role, so just wanted you to be aware of that. So that is tonight's talk. We spoke, in summary, about how the gut and the brain are really in this incredible alliance between these two incredible organs, and that the alliance is in many ways moderated by this vagus nerve that is carrying messages from the brain down and from the gut up to the brain. It's an incredible thing. We've spoken about how there are certain genes that can affect various mental states, and we spoke in general about the mental health crisis that we're going through and various different causes of depression, excluding the psychological aspect, just looking at it, as I called this, depression and the body. So next week, we are going to be talking about the brain again, but we're going to be talking about different states of the way your brain behaves. Like as an example, the alpha state. The alpha state is a state of relaxation where you can often get like really good ideas. The alpha state is something that can be, walking by the beach can activate the alpha state. Taking a shower can activate the alpha state. And there are all these other states that really are readily available to us that, we sometimes sort of just think about. We think about mood, we think about sleep, we think about awake. But I'd like to ignore all of those and talk about the different states of being, states of consciousness that are readily available to us to improve the quality of our lives. And of course, how these things affect the body. Believe it or not, certain things happen when you're in the alpha state and you're in this state of deeper relaxation. There are deeper and deeper levels of relaxation. And so next week, we'll be talking about that and how to potentially activate, get into the alpha state a little bit more, those sorts of things. And I think you'll find it very interesting. So I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. As always, my goal is for you to become your own authority in health. And I hope that with these talks, you are getting a better, and I would hope that you're seeing how incredibly miraculous the human body is and how incredibly interconnected it is. I find it to be a miraculous thing, and I hope that you're getting a sense of that as well. So I hope everyone has a great night and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye. Oh, let me see if there are any questions. Oh, one question was what I meant by a slow exhalation, meaning if you breathe in for 1 second, a slow exhalation would be an exhalation out of 2 seconds. So a slow out breath. That would be what I'm. So in other words, a lot of times we often activate this parasympathetic nervous system involuntarily. How do we do that? We sigh. And when we sigh, that's our body. When we sigh involuntarily, it's our body basically trying its best to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So there you have it. Your body has this almost a defense mechanism that we sigh and it makes us feel a little better. Why? Because oddly enough, we're activating the vagus nerve and the rest and recharge part of our body. So everyone, have a great night. And again, I look forward to